So thank you for being here with us, Archer. Archer Mayer, in addition to writing the New York Times bestselling Joe Gunther series, is an investigator for the Sheriff's Department, the state medical examiner, and has 25 years of experience as a firefighter and EMT. He lives near Brattleboro, Vermont. So thank you very much. And I'll let you take it from here.
Well, I know I write fiction, but that biography was total fiction. I am not the chief medical examiner. I'm a death investigator who works for the chief medical examiner in Vermont. I am also retired as a cop. I was an investigator for the sheriff's department and for the state's attorney's office here in Windham County in Vermont. But the rest of it, the firefighter and the EMS and even the National Ski Patrol, all that is accurate. So that is in the nature of full disclosure. So sorry for that little piece of mythology. I have no idea how these things get translated, but it's kind of like that game of telephone, I suspect. And by the time it all ends up, on the internet, Lord knows who I am and what I've done. But that's it from the horse's mouth. We're here tonight, and thank you very much for joining us so that you can pick my brains. I'm going to break the ice a little bit and tell you about this 30-second book in the Joe Gunther series entitled Marked Man. But I'm just doing that to warm things up a little bit. I'm actually perhaps even more fascinated than you as to why we're all here tonight. I want to find out what's on your minds, and therefore I'm going to very shortly segue over to questions. So get prepared to ask your questions. Whether you type them in or you hit the mute or whatever, I guess our hostess will tell us what works best for her. But that's what I hope will be the organizational element of this evening. Marked Man, like I said, is number 32. It takes place primarily in Brattleboro, and about 1/3 of it takes place in Providence. Well, not actually Providence, Rhode Island in general. In and around Providence. The reason I did that is because when I was growing up, a hopeless number of decades ago, uh, Rhode Island was always considered the crookedest state in New England, and I sort of loved that. And I used to go down to Rhode Island recreationally just to presume that most of the people I saw were either mafia connected to the Catholic Church, and maybe all of them slightly crooked. But that was my fantasy as a young man. Nowadays, I'm sure that Rhode Island glows in the dark for its virtue. And that I say for the sake of the Chamber of Commerce. And in case anyone's from Rhode Island, now you officially can't sue me, I hope. Well, anybody can sue anybody, but be gentle. I also try to write all these books from a vantage point that I haven't utilized before. And in this instance, in the tiniest and most oblique homage to Agatha Christie, I thought it might be amusing to sort of parallel one of those Miss Marple books and have everything occur in a closed setting. So what I employed, rather than St. Mary Mead or a closed locked room or something like that, is that I used one of these enormous brick clad mill buildings that we see so commonly in New England. I certainly have a number of them in nearby Brattleboro, Vermont. And I'm sure that anybody in New England is so familiar with those things that they virtually can't spend a day without glimpsing at least one. They are enormous. They are multi-storied. They occupy 200,000 square feet. They have huge windows. Oftentimes, they are sitting on sort of environmentally unstable land, and therefore they're very difficult to do anything with. Some of them have been turned into malls, as we know, and maybe business complexes. But I thought it would be amusing to take a fictional exemplar of this in Brattleboro and to turn it into a single family dwelling that measures 150,000 square feet. Talk about a vacuum job. So I have a hopelessly wealthy millionaire do this, and he then scrapes together a fairly well-sized family, and he puts them all under the roof. Now, I don't know about you and your family, but I would have a hard time putting my family under one roof. I'm the bottom of six kids, and while we all get along, none of us would probably want to live with each other or one another. And but if you are such a man as my millionaire fella, who is also a psychopath, a crook, highly manipulative, and a murderer, then hey, the gloves are off. And he therefore came up with a set of rules that basically coerced all his family members and their assorted appendages, wives and children and whatnot, to live under this, to live in this mill with him. Uh, Now, here's the catch, and that is that at the very, very beginning of Marked Man, this guy is dead. He starts the book dead, and believe it or not, he ends the book dead. And that allowed me to try something out, which I've always fantasized a little bit about. And that is that in my family, if we die, because we live to be extraordinarily old in my family, both my parents made it to 99 years old. Uh, when they finally do die, my family tends to donate their bodies to science. In other words, a medical school. And so I thought I'd have this guy whose ego is presumably enormous. He donated himself to science as well, probably under the sensation that there had never been a finer body to dissect than his. Well, several months later, when the book opens up, we have a medical student, therefore, working on this fellow. And as the student works his way slowly up the length of the body, he discovers something in this area here in the neck. And he's got his professor standing beside him. And in short course, this is all in chapter one, he turns to the professor and he says, what's this thing I just discovered, this anomaly? And the professor peers at the site that he indicates, and she says to him, that is a homicide. So that begins the story. Obviously, this fella, for all his manipulations and machinations, he ended up getting murdered. And who knew? Because he's been in this medical school for 6 months and nobody thought that he died of anything other than natural causes. So the story begins. Joe Gunther is contacted by his other half, Beverly Hillstrom, the chief medical examiner, and the two of them begin this investigation, which eventually leads them to Rhode Island, because that, as it turns out, is where this nefarious fella made his bundle before he moved to Brattleboro 20 or 30 years ago, bought the mill, and began to torture his family through his skullduggery ways. So that sort of is Marked Man in a nutshell. As usual, I had great fun layering the book. You get to know the family members I just discussed. Of course, you get to visit Joe and his pals. And in addition, we have two young women, one a private investigator and one a reporter, both of who have appeared in the books before, Sally and Rachel, and they are hot on the trail as well. So layer on layer on layer, things got complicated enough that for the first time in my series of books, I actually put in a couple of charts that, with arrows and boxes so that help you along. I was a little nervous about that, to be honest, because I'd never done that. And I didn't want people to think, well, for God's sake, if you can't even describe this complexity, but you have to use visual aids, then we're all in trouble. But apparently, you guys are all pretty quick on your feet, because this book has already garnered 2 early starred reviews from fairly prominent periodicals. And so I feel pretty good. I thank you and them and everybody else who's so far given this book a thumbs up. Um, that being the case, I'm sure that today actually is the official publication date. So not many people have had a chance to read this except those reviewers. But I'd love to open the floor to any questions you might have for me. And that can touch on anything. It can be on the book. It can be about writing in general. It can be about some of my crazy other occupations that I listed off. But it has to start with one of you. So I'm going to lapse into silence, and one of you can weigh in and ask a question, and we'll get the ball rolling. Oh, I see something appearing on the screen, but I
All
can't.
right. Yep. So I can read that for you. So this question is from Scott, is it Albergate? He says, I'm curious to know how you approach writing a book which, per your summary, is well plotted and layered, as you say. Do you start with outlining?
Yes. Highly pertinent question, because I don't. And I know I probably should. It'd be far more efficient. But the way I approach things, it would be, to my taste bud, overly mechanical. In other words, the end results, and I've done this through experimentation because I began writing in the 1970s. So I've been at this quite a stretch. And I found that when I outlined or even came up with a plot, I found the mechanism of that roadmap to be too powerful to superimpose itself over the spontaneity of what I was eager to see the characters do. So instead, I approach writing in a completely different way. I approach it from a basis of ignorance and curiosity. Every book I write approaches something I know nothing about. A simplistic example would be, just because I touched on it, Rhode Island. What do I know about Rhode Island? Well, virtually nothing. So I want to find out about, law enforcement, about crookery, about what they eat down there, how they function, how their society is different from the one I inhabit. All of that good stuff, because I hope that that'll be interesting and educational for my readers, which is another interest of mine, is to be useful to my readers. So that's just a simplistic example of what sets me down a path. So I go to Rhode Island, I talk to lots of people who know the things I don't know. And I do that in every single book. I educate myself, and I educate myself to excess. In other words, I do enough research to probably fill 3 books. And the reason that I do that is because of the lack of plot or outline. When I finally sort of fill my head with enough answers or ideas or vague notions, I begin to write, and I start, realistically enough, with chapter 1. And uh, I do sort of work hard at chapter 1. I want to make sure that the diving board that I'm about to spring off of is solid and well connected. And after that, I just write as you read. I go one page at a time. And as I write, my brain begins to formulate some sort of directionality, and I follow that path. as it develops. Do I make mistakes or do I go down wrong paths? Not as often as one might think. But again, I've been at this for half a century, so maybe that's not too startling. The exercise is really not complete upon the finishing of that first draft. And that's the key part of all this and the answer to your question. And that is that when I write a book, the writing of it is only the first half. The second half of the exercise is in the editing and rewriting. So let's say, as in this case, I write an approximately 300-page book. I will go over that alone and with the help of trusted people who accompany me in this process over the years. Oh, good Lord, sometimes up to 12, 15 different times, again and again and again. And what is my goal? It's to clean and shorten and smooth out the rough edges, both in terms of eloquence, language usage, and also in terms of logic. Was it a red house in chapter 1 and a blue house in chapter 5? I need to straighten all that stuff out. That's relatively easy to do, but to render the language into a sort of almost a musicality is very important to me. I don't want to just tell a tale. I don't want to dash off a story. I want to be able to suggest a tall tale that you will take into your brain and turn into a mental movie. And the reason I do that is because I've never forgotten what it's like to be a reader first. And I, as a happy reader, I want to embrace the story as my own. I don't want the writer getting in my way. I don't want to hear the writer's voice. I want to be able to smell the smells being described. I want to be able to imagine the settings and hear the voices in my ear. That's what's going to entrap me. And it's going to make me late for dinner. And it's going to make me forget that I, didn't take the clothes out of the dryer and whatever. This is the wonderful thing that John Gardner once described as the fictional dream. You just enter this nether or space in your own brain. And the book you're reading becomes a little more than a guide to your own creative juices, your own storytelling desire. And thus, you and I, as reader and writer, become co-storytellers. And that's why I edit the way I do, because I really want to sort of vanish from view. I want you guys to embrace the story, but I also want you to fall into the embrace of seamless language usage, so that occasionally you might even go, wow, I hadn't thought of a scene described like that, or wow, that's evocative or interesting or nicely described. And that enhances the experience and makes it that much more seductive to read. Um, all of which is to say that in my personal experience, if I stuck to a plot or an outline instead of this somewhat more cumbersome process I employ, I think I would sound more artificial. I would be caught in a position where my characters, instead of following their own sense, they would be following the plot that I laid out before I began to write. And I don't like that. I don't like that sort of upside down way of approaching things as I personally see it. If it works for someone else to, very meticulously lay everything out, well, fine, more power to them. It just doesn't work for me. So that's my answer to that.
Thank you. That was a great answer and a great question, Scott. That term when you used layering, that was actually something that stuck out to me, layering the book, and I thought that was really interesting. I have another question here from Doris, and she asks, did you have any idea 32 books ago that Joe Gunther would last this long?
No, I had no idea. No, but it's interesting you should ask that, Doris, because that's been an odd and sort of a wonderful journey for me, and an unexpected one. I began the series as a series. So right from the get-go, I knew there would be more than one Joe Gunther book. And I knew when I rolled up my sleeves that I would uh, be evolutionary in my storytelling. I, however, suspected that I might write 5 books or something like that. And either I would move on, attracted by some other enthusiasm, or I'd be so hopelessly wealthy I'd be isolated on my own private island and pick up fishing for an occupation. I don't know. Anyhow, that latter fantasy never occurred. I still drive a used pickup truck, and despite your best efforts to keep me alive, that's what you do. You have not made me a millionaire, and I am not complaining because of the second surprise evolution to all this, which was I began to realize that I didn't want to leave Joe Gunther. Joe Gunther, and by that name, I of course mean the setting, all the other characters, the the sort of gestalt of Joe Gunther, if you want to use nonsense language, that had become extraordinarily meaningful to me. I had discovered by beginning this series of books, that I was beginning to examine human nature. What makes us tick? These were very quickly no longer whodunits, but why donuts? What makes us do the things we do? When I started this series, I had read murder mysteries, of course, but I chose to write murder mysteries just because they were popular and I wanted to make a living. But I was also intrigued by the question, what makes murder mysteries so enormously popular? I mean, it's all about people killing one another. It doesn't seem like a terribly attractive type of literature. But to be honest, when does a day go by that you don't consult the news and find about some violence that human beings have committed against each other? I mean, it never stops. So obviously, it's one of our less fortunate but very common expressions is to render ill upon each other, and I became quite fascinated with that. Now, I'm like everybody else. I have a past. I have had experiences at a far younger age that were not pleasant, and we all have this. And but they left me my particular experience at the hands of misfortune were such as to change my life utterly and to make me extremely thoughtful about why people are motivated to do certain heinous things to their fellow human being. And I had no intention of examining this when I began the Joe Gunther series, but I found myself as if I had been sort of uh, uh, subconsciously motivated to do this. I found myself examining that very question. And it was therefore kind of a seamless and accidental discovery that, yes, I'm writing murder mysteries because I want to become a professional writer. And this is what I most love to do with language. But also, oh my God, I'm discovering things about myself, about other humans. The research that I'm conducting is exposing me and educating me, and I hope making me somewhat wiser in the ways of the world. This then led to my becoming a police officer, to becoming an EMT and firefighter, to my becoming, and still am, a death investigator for the state. It was an extraordinary snowballing effect that all of this had. And Joe Gunther was at the core of it, because all these other things I did, uh, I could go back to Joe Gunther as the laboratory, as the place where I digested what I'd learned out there in the real streets. As a cop, for example, my specialty was sex crimes against children. So it wasn't that I was just pulling over speeders, some guy in a uniform. Some of the things that I've been exposed to are quite unpleasant. And if you do that, oftentimes it messes with your brain. But here, even before I began these other occupations, I already had an outlet. I had a think tank, if you will. I had a place I could visit in these novels as a writer where I could consider some of the horrors that I was routinely exposed to, and weigh them, and have fictional characters talk about them and experience them and whatnot. So and last but not least, then I thought, well, I am being useful to society and all these other jobs. Perhaps I can be useful to my readers by sharing a little bit of what I'm learning. And as a result, uh, I didn't stop at 5 books. I didn't stop at 10 books. Obviously, I can do whatever I'd like to do. Because I, like everyone else, has those capabilities. I could deliver mail for a living or whatever, pound nails, but I had gotten hooked, and I never got tired of it because, well, actually, just to divert a little bit, people ask me, where do you get your ideas? And the answer is simplicity itself. I wake up every morning and I venture forth into the world. Those are my ideas. I write about us. Joe Gunther is his name. Joe Gunther is as plain a name as it is because he's us. He's you guys. I'm writing about you. I'm writing about me. And as a result, I'll never run out of ideas. Um, so that may be way more philosophical an answer than you were looking for, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, that was a great response. I think it's really interesting how you can develop a relationship with a character that you create. And that's actually what you were just saying is actually a great lead in to the next question that we have for you, which comes from Michael. And Michael is asking, since you are clearly conscious and considerate of your audience, how would you describe your reader?
Oh, gosh. Well, of course, I don't know them all, and I don't get the feedback. I mean, there are thousands of them. I can say that blessedly and gratefully, uh, but I guess the feedback that I do get, these are thoughtful, caring folks who are as interested as I am in the human condition. And they are equally willing to admit that they ain't got all the answers. Uh, and uh, and the exploration is part of the fun of being alive. That's about as far as I go. I try not to pigeonhole my readers. In many ways, I don't even try to think of them too much because this is a very personal journey. I will be considerate of them in that all the things that I evoked earlier about my trying to place these stories into their heads so they can take them over and forget all about me. But by the same token, I don't want to objectify them. I don't want them to fit into some narrow category, and therefore I'm writing to them. That would be overly commercial. and I have no interest. Obviously, I have to make a living, and I'm grateful that you have allowed me to make a living. But I don't want to turn out a product for sale. I want to turn out something that genuinely comes from my heart and my head, and which seems to be of interest to yours. And that's about as commercial as I get.
Okay, thank you. Um, so Dottie asked the question, did a favored charity benefit from one or more of your characters in Marked Man? Would you share the charity and the characters?
Yes, yeah, that's very amusing. I laugh because so many years ago now, I just can't recall when this started, but many, many, many years ago, and many, many books ago, somebody approached me. Now these charities, they're hospitals or they're humane societies or halfway houses or Lord knows what, and they're all obviously what I consider good causes, altruistic organizations. And one of those contacted me in past history and said, "Oh golly gee, would you give me a hardback? Would you give us a hardback and we'll auction it off?" And I sort of thought to myself, well, what are you going to get from that? In those days, these prices were relatively low, $18. I said, well, what are you going to get out of an $18 hardback? Not much. And I had heard through the grapevine that some fancy writer somewhere, I can't remember who, had auctioned off a single character name, and this was a big deal. There was big falderall and headline news and blah blah blah. But I didn't want to do that. Plus, who am I? I'm just a work a journeyman writer, so I'm not someone fancy or super well known. But I like the idea. I thought that was nice, and I thought it would generate more money than just a hardback would, and it amused me. So I've suggested to this organization, what do you say we auction off a character instead of a book? You can be a character in the next Joe Gunther book, but and I'm very grateful I came up with this. I had a proviso, and the proviso was and still is I get to do anything I want with that name, including a gender change. I mean, if your name is Randy and I decide to make that a female or a male, then I get to do that. As for whether good guy, bad guy, live guy, dead guy, that's up to me, and you don't get to say anything. So understanding the rules of engagement, if you still want to do the auction, then more power to you. Well, thus began a tradition whereby in every single book, including in Mark Man, uh, I have, I don't know what the average is, but it goes anywhere from 6 to 10 character names belong to real people who have won various auctions, and the auctions change. So I can't run one up the flagpole and say, this is the organization I most believe in, um, because that's not the case. They come to me. An example of a regular one is that I live in Vermont, and there's the state's smallest rural hospital is my next door neighbor up the street, well, up the road. And they have a tradition of every year coming and knocking on my door and saying, well, can we do this again? And I'm always happy to let them do it. The point of the exercise is that I think, as far as I ever hear, I obviously get the names, but I don't hear the details of how much money was raised or whatnot. But I have heard through the grapevine that the top price that I've been able to generate is $2,500 for a single name. So obviously, while I don't benefit from that except through goodwill, the organization that approached me is doing a lot better than they might have if I just sent them a hardback book. And I end up with a name. Sometimes they're tricky names to deal with. But most of the time, they're quite seamless and quite fun. Only once in my experience has this sort of bit me in the ankle, whereby, for some strange reason, I don't know why it happened just uniquely. Thank God it was just uniquely, but I ended up with 15 auction winners. And I was sort of stuck thinking, oh my God, should I all put them all in a bus and have them go over a cliff and then have one investigator say, oh, we're so sorry that so and so and so and so and so and so and so all died. In that way, I could get rid of my obligation. Obviously, I didn't do that, but I also thought to myself, "Whoa, I'm going to have to give this a little bit of a cooling off period." So I've never gone over 10 names per book because it gets a little complicated sometimes. But it's great fun, and it's hardly an overwhelming objection on my part. And I'm happy to aid and abet, and everyone seems to sort of find it kind of amusing when they read the books, and above and beyond the enjoyment they're getting from the book, they all of a sudden go, "Oh my God, there's Fred in there! I didn't know he was that way," you know. So I get a kick out of that.
I was just gonna say, I'd be a little nervous to find out what I did that I didn't know that I did.
Yeah, well, exactly right. Exactly
My
right.
mysterious self, you know.
Yes, yes, exactly. Beware what you wish for.
So Bob has the question, how did you come up with Willie Kunkel?
Willie Kunkel. Let me start with Joe Gunther, because when you consider Joe Gunther, here is a guy, and I designed Joe Gunther quite on purpose. I designed him as an anti-hero to the anti-hero, anti-hero. What I was aware of was that in this type of fiction, and you see it on TV all the time, is that the hero has got to be fractured somehow or another. He's got some metaphysical or psychological or emotional problem. He's a drinker. He's been married 43 times. I don't know what, but that he has to have a sword hanging over his head. And we're supposed to, I don't know, feel sorry for the guy. Well, I'm working in the trenches, and one of the reasons I do is so that when I describe these people, I actually know who I'm talking about. And my colleagues out there in the field, they're not particularly more burdened by a tragedy than I am. We're just normal grunts doing our job and trying to be useful to society. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to design a series of books around an individual who is honest, normal, named Joe. He's a team player. He's got integrity 101 that can't be faulted. In other words, he's kind of a Boy Scout. He's not a superhuman guy. He makes mistakes on a regular basis, but he is a nice guy. Well, I've just described the world's most boring hero, ergo Willie Kunkel, because if I can offset Joe Gunther with the likes of Willie Kunkel, who is none of the above, then I've got sort of, equal halves of what makes most of us tick. We may start the day hoping to be just like Joe Gunther because, hey, it's hard to improve on that particular model. But I don't know about you guys, but 10 minutes into every day, I've already had my first Willie Kunkel moment. I've said something or thought something or acted on some impulse that was not Joe Gunther in appearance. It was Willie Kunkel. Now, my daughter will tell you that I really have nothing to do with Joe Gunther. I am all Willie Kunkel myself. So I'm not drawing far from the well when I describe Willie. Well, that's a daughter speaking, and I'd like to think that she's having a little bit of fun at my expense. Maybe, daughters. But that having been said, Willie Kunkel is a guy I have been told that more people associate with or recognize or empathize with than Joe Gunther. I remember asking back in the days when I, inquired about this, but then I got sort of depressed by the answers. I would ask fellow cops, "Well, have you ever worked with Joe Gunther?" And they'd all go, "What? Are you crazy? Joe? No, we don't work with the likes of Joe Gunther." And then they would volunteer and they'd say, "Oh, but Willie Kunkel, now Kunkel, I know Kunkel. I work with him and blah blah blah." So I finally went, "Oh God, what have I done?" But that's where Willie Kunkel comes from. Willie Kunkel represents truly the things that we either try to stay clear of in our own adventures through life, or more sadly, he represents times that truly have been tough for some of us. But he's a survivor. The thing about Willie Kunkel, the saving grace, is that he is an honest man. He is honest with himself. He may be weak. He may have stumbled, but he has stayed true to his sense of integrity and his sense of mission, which is to redeem and to set an example now to his child and to his colleagues that he has bettered himself, and that he is a person. You may not like him, but you can rely on him. Willie Kunkel is complicated, and I like to keep him complicated. Through the series of books, I've altered him, I've softened him. He now has Sammy Martin's in his life. They live together and they have begot a child. And Willie is quite tender with that child, and he thinks quite a bit about it. The sense of responsibility given who he sees in the mirror versus his fears of that he doesn't want any of that to visit upon his kid. That's a tension that he has to deal with on a regular basis. So all of that, I think, is reflective of some of us. So that's where Willie Kunkel comes from.
I think it's really interesting how you talk about him being altered over time, and how just kind of maybe there's a tendency to think of or even to forget that characters change over time and they morph and grow. I don't know, that's really interesting. Our next question is from Michael, and Michael is asking, will the pandemic figure into any future work?
No. And the reason is the following, Michael. The pandemic, while I absolutely recognize its effect on the world, it's had virtually no effect on me. And when I say me, I mean as an emergency responder. I've been responding to pages, pager calls, for 40 plus years. Well, about 40 years. And when you do so in whatever guise, we've rattled off the various things I've done on an emergency basis, you don't have a choice. Nowadays, I put on a mask, but I still have to go out. All cops do. All investigators do. We're not asked whether, well, golly gee, there's a pandemic out, so you might want to not go on this call. We go on the call. So the only change in my life, and my life is what I sort of represent in my series of books, which is emergency responders. My life hasn't altered any. We wear masks. That's about the only thing that's changed. Cops, EMTs, firefighters, death investigators, we're all still out in the trenches. Now, selfishly, of course, I also happen to have another job, that as a writer. And for that, I'm all alone working in a room. So I don't have the knowledge that other people have working in a factory or a business or something that has been utterly disrupted by COVID. I have not been. And in a funny kind of way, although I did write a book that featured the tropical storm Irene, because Irene devastated Vermont. And I did want to put that into a book because it did affect emergency responders big time. COVID, curiously, really hasn't. Now, if I wrote about people who work and live in hospitals, I would sing a completely different tune, and I'd be very keenly interested in writing a book along those lines. But that's not my realm of operations, if you will. I don't write about people who work in hospitals. And it would be, I think, a little lopsided if I wrote a COVID book just so that I could speak empathetically and descriptively about hospital workers. It would be I'm I don't want to exploit the misery of others, and to write a COVID book when I don't have personal exposure to that, or my livelihood or my daily activity hasn't been threatened by COVID. I mean, one could argue it has been because I'm the guy they call to identify whether you died of COVID. So I'm in the front ranks in a very narrow, specific way. But nevertheless, I would just feel a little uncomfortable about that. I think it would be too made up. So I can see your question, Michael, but I guess that's why I don't think at this point. You never say never, but I don't think that I'll be referring to COVID in the books.
That was that was real. That I just kept thinking of what you said earlier in when you're initially talking about character development and kind of how that all ties together about kind of being true to who, I don't know, your own kind of journey. And it's really
Yeah. Well, you know that they say, write what you know.
and
So
learn what you don't.
yeah, exactly right.
So Scott has a question, and he wanted to know what some of your favorite mystery authors, who are some of your favorite mystery authors?
Well, they aren't current. I was influenced early by the likes of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, Sherlock Holmes, even Agatha Christie to a lesser extent, especially by a guy named Ross MacDonald, whose real name was Ken Miller. And he wrote a series of books, about 18 to 20 books, based on a private eye named Lou Archer. And the Paul Newman movie Harper was based on one of those books. Those were the guys on whom I cut my teeth. But once I engaged in this career, as you now know, one thing led to another, and I became a cop, and I became all these other things that we've talked about. The end result of that is that I personally, when I retire at the end of a long day, curling up with a good murder mystery is the last thing I want to do. Uh, be, my life is filled with misery and loss and conflict and general unhappiness. I'm constantly wading into other people's misery, and I don't want to read that kind of stuff. Also, being a writer of murder mysteries, I'm hypercritical. It's like, as a retired cop, I don't like watching most cop shows because they do things improperly, and that bugs me. So, you know, um, now I've lost my train of thought. What was the question again? I do
Well,
this.
it had to do with your favorite mystery
Yes, yes,
writers, but if
yes,
you have like a favorite, romance author or beach read, you can share
yeah,
that as
yeah,
well.
yeah. No, no, I apologize for that. I have these, I guess, so lost in the answer, and this is actually what you just got there was a snapshot of how I write. Because without an outline or a plot, I just go. And if I go right instead of going left, that's fine. I keep on
It's like,
following.
how many of ourselves are we talking to?
Yes, exactly. That's a dangerous question. Uh, Anyhow, the punchline is that the current writers of fiction, and I'm aware of who they are. I've even met some of them when I go out on the road and I have to go to a convention or something like that. So I've met Louise Penny, for example, but I don't read Louise Penny because my fondness and my training. When I was first a writer, I actually wrote history books. So I may have written 32 Joe Gunthers, but I've written 35 books. And I began life as a historian. And to this day, my favorite reading are history books or science books. Those are the two categories that catch my my appetite nowadays. Um, so I'm sort of the world's worst person to approach, as one logically would, and say, "Who's your favorite murder mystery writer?" And I'd say, "Well, I don't know who's doing what out there." Um, Sorry about that.
I think the truth is always the way to go.
Ever
um,
so awkward sometimes, but
what
yeah,
was that?
be it ever so awkward sometimes.
Yeah, thrive in our own awkwardness. Yeah. Ellen has a question and she's wondering, this is a longer one, so I'm just reading through it. She says, in some ways, I'm more into settings than characters. How much background and how do you get into, grocery, warehouse, ski area, even the current brick factory, a steep hillside with rocks held back by metal grid, etc. Visit them, she says. So I think she's wondering how you get into the
Yeah,
settings
no,
and
that all makes perfect sense to me. I from the get-go, from the very beginning of this series of books, my intention, if I had a plan at all, the plan was to make place a character, and as much one of the characters as the human beings I portrayed. That's one of the reasons I chose Vermont for this series of books, because I inhabit Vermont, and therefore I could travel all over the state. And indeed, in the second book of the series, Borderlines, I'm already out of Brattleboro. So I tried to train my readership that with this would be Vermont based. It wouldn't even be Brattleboro based. It would go beyond. And since then, of course, I've gone to Canada, I go to Rhode Island, I go to New Hampshire, I go to Massachusetts, I go to all sorts of places. Even Chicago, I'll go far afield. But the point of the exercise was that I wanted to reflect what I think is a fundamental reality to us all. When we meet one another for the first time at a party or wherever, uh, oftentimes after the exchange of names, we inquire where we're from. Oh, that's an interesting accent you have. Oh, well, how long have you lived in the area? Or I heard you just arrived, or whatever. We identify ourselves to one another geographically. I find that to be almost perpetual, almost inevitable. And I think it goes back to, good Lord, when people lived in, the mountain caves versus they lived in the valley caves. And it's a sense of identity. We are people of place, and we identify ourselves as such to one another. And I wanted to make that true in my books as well. So miniaturizing from the greater palette of New England and Vermont, that then you can see how it brings me to individual places like the factory buildings that stand in lieu of Vermont, or as exemplars of the Rust Belt, New England, if you will. I love doing that. In Marked Man, When I have Joe Gunther and the others go to Rhode Island, I talk about Rhode Island as a historical and cultural place. And I touch a little bit on its industrial evolution and how it started here and ended up there. And I do that because I think that's of interest to almost everybody. You don't, this is a fine line. You have to tiptoe because you don't ever, I don't ever want to end up on a soapbox and start lecturing people. Oh, now here comes the history lesson. Oh, here comes the geography lesson. I want this to be as seamless as it is when we're driving along, all of us on a daily basis, and we look out the window and we go, oh, look at that. That's unusual. I hadn't noticed that, but it seems to fit into the overall environment that I'm traveling through. I want that seamlessness to be true in the books as it is in our day-to-day living.
Some of the things you're saying really remind me of just, I just visited Pennsylvania and just talking about the differences in people and the landscape there and how that's all intertwined.
Yeah.
The miners, that's such a big part of the culture,
Right.
for generations, and
Yes.
how
Yes.
that's just kind of, it's a part of that, the landscape. And the way that people interact with one another, it
Hmm.
shapes them, and it shapes us.
Yeah.
And what you're saying, you had kind of mentioned something which I know we only have just a few minutes left, but Michael had posted something here, and he was saying something about Gunther's internal dialogue is totally believable.
Thank you.
And he says, does it come to you fully formed, or is the process more involved?
It's pretty full. It's pretty fully formed. I try to be utterly honest when I write, and I try to reflect what I would think in a situation that Joe Gunther inhabits. It's easier for me because I'm not just a writer sitting in a chair with a tweedy outfit on and a hunting dog by my feet, nursing a meerschaum pipe. I actually function out in Joe Gunther's world. So I can easily imagine what it's like to be in his shoes. And as such, it's a real comfort zone for me to think about how I felt in similar circumstances. Obviously, my life is far less adventuresome than Joe Gunther's. People aren't trying to shoot at me or blow me up or anything else, but I have known enough people who have been in precarious situations, my colleagues, and myself. I may have, ducked a swinging fist or two. And I can extrapolate from all that from personal knowledge. So uh, I I don't have to conjure too much of that up. As I say, I enter these scenes, and the characters suggest what they're thinking, and I don't find myself in the editorial process subsequent to the writing. I may enhance a little bit of the reflection or the introspection as I see a need for it. And my editors, my wife paramount among them, might suggest, you need a little bit more background, a little more thoughtfulness. What was this character thinking as she or he did this and that? And I'll go, yeah, yeah. But I never put in too much more than I've already put in. It's pretty much there from the get-go.
Well, thank you so much. And I guess I want to tell everyone again, go out and buy your copy of Marked Man. And I guess I should say, share it so that Archer will keep on writing. And We don't want to sell too many copies, but so that you don't make your millions yet, right?
Yeah, don't want me on that island. God forbid.
Yeah, yeah. But no, I'm really looking forward to checking it out. Just came out today. So thank you so much, Archer, and thank you for everyone for joining us. And we look forward to reading your book and hopefully seeing you in person next time.
Yeah,
Um,
that'd be great. That'd be
yeah.
great. But I thank you in turn. You guys made this evening very entertaining for me, and thank you for carrying the load. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, take care.
Have a
Night
great
night.
night.